The Geneva node was already burned when I arrived. I knew it at 0847 hours, standing on the Quai du Mont-Blanc and watching a man I had never seen before sit down at the specific bench where the node's emergency signal should have been. Not the bench's regular occupant, the custodian who had been maintaining the Geneva node since the Beirut formalization in 2003, a Swiss financial analyst whose institutional position inside one of Geneva's major private banks had provided both the operational access and the professional cover that the node required. A different man. Wrong age, wrong build, wrong professional bearing, the right bench, the wrong person. I had 3 seconds to decide. 3 seconds is not 11 seconds. 11 seconds is the formation's threshold for controlled response to catastrophic information. 3 seconds is the threshold for immediate physical threat assessment, the specific window when the tactical situation requires a decision before the assessment is complete, when acting on incomplete information is operationally preferable to the cost of waiting for complete information. 3 seconds. I turned left toward the Quai du Mont-Blanc, walked at a pace that matched the morning pedestrian flow on the quai, and did not look back. The Geneva node was burned, the 5th city in the physical archives distribution network. The location that Walsh had established in 2003 and that the archive's most sensitive cross-referencing material had been stored in since the Beirut formalization. The location that the archive's security protocols had been specifically designed to protect, burned. Not by the standard institutional channels those had been unable to reach the archive, since the methodology had been designed to be invisible to them, by something else, by someone who knew the bench, who knew the signal, who had replaced the custodian. Welcome to the Grey Geneva, October 2007, 6 months after Amsterdam. 6 months during which the external review pathway had been producing the specific kind of institutional friction that external review pathways produce when they are operating correctly, the friction of a judicial mechanism. Receiving sealed evidentiary submissions from a non-institutional source that has the probability weight to support the submission. The friction of an institutional actor that cannot absorb the mechanism through the standard channels, because the mechanism has been specifically designed to operate outside them. 6 months of friction. 6 months of the archive growing at 0.99, while the external review pathway slowly activated the institutional response that the documentation had been building toward since Budapest in 1993. And now, the Geneva node. Burned. I will give you the Geneva posting's operational context before I give you what happened next, because the context explains why the bench mattered more than the burned node's evidentiary consequences, and why the 3 seconds of observation on the Quai du Mont-Blanc were the most operationally significant 3 seconds in the operational career since the 47 seconds in the Warsaw doorway in November of the Quai-Devation. 2005. The Geneva node's custodian, the Swiss financial analyst, whose identity is in the physical archive and not in this account, had been maintaining the node for 4 years. 4 years of dead-drop protocol discipline, of cross-referencing material discipline, of the specific operational security that a non-institutional archive custodian maintains when the archive's security is the primary operational requirement. 4 years without compromise. The Geneva node had survived the entity's December 2005 access to the Washington node. It had survived the MARTA contact network's partial penetration. It had survived the Walsh legal mechanism's public exposure of the archive's existence. 4 years. Clean. Until October 2007. The posting had begun 2 weeks earlier, in late September. Undercover, as an independent financial research consultant whose work brought me into the specific institutional network of Geneva's private banking sector, the operational environment that the Geneva node's custodian worked within, and that the posting's collection requirements had identified as the specific environment in which the financial network's 2007 activities needed to be documented. The cover was appropriate and thin The standard post-Amsterdam operational configuration. 2 weeks of standard preparation work before the scheduled node contact on October 14. The scheduled contact. October 14. 084. 7 hours. The Quai du Mont-Blanc bench. The wrong man. I walked to the Pont du Mont-Blanc and stood at the bridge's center for 43 seconds, watching the Rhône below. The river exits Lake Geneva at the city's western edge, channeled between the lake's output and the city's historic center, moving at approximately 2.1 meters per second, faster than the Vistula, faster than the Vltava. The specific pace of an alpine river that has descended from high elevation and carries the force of that descent in its current. Gray-blue, the specific color of glacial meltwater that has carried fine rock flour from the Mont Blanc Massif's glaciers, not agricultural sediment like the Vistula, not ancient silt like the Nile. Glacial flour, the finest possible rock particles, the specific product of ice-grinding stone across geological time, filed. The formation had registered a new water body, the Rhône. The 19th water body in 24 years of operational geography, and the first time the formation had registered a water body under conditions of active operational threat rather than morning calibration. The 43 seconds produced 3 assessments. First, the wrong man on the bench was not a surveillance operator. His body language was active, not passive. He was waiting for someone, rather than watching for someone. The behavioral signature of a contact, not a watcher. Second, a contact replacing the custodian at the node's emergency signal location indicated either the custodian had been compromised and replaced by the entity's operation, or the custodian had been compromised and was using the WADE replacement as an intermediary to communicate an emergency. Third, the probability assessment for the entity's operational involvement had reached 0.88 inches, 43 seconds, without the full analytical process that 11 seconds normally produced. 0.88 under physical time pressure is the formation's equivalent of 0.96 under analytical conditions, sufficient to act on. I turned from the bridge and walked back along the quay, not toward the bench, toward the dead drop backup location that the Geneva node's security protocol had established in 2003 for exactly this category of operational emergency, a location separate from the bench, unknown to anyone outside the archive's custodian network, accessible through the dead drop methodology that had been operational since the Galata Bridge in Istanbul in 2001. The backup location was in the Vieille Geneva's Old City, on the hill above the lake, behind a specific stone element of the Cathedral Saint-Pierre's exterior that had provided natural concealment since the backup location was established. 7 minutes from the quay on foot, through the old city's narrow streets, the backup location contained a message, not a 7-sentence Kareem communication, not a 4-word alert. A single word, written in the specific notation that the archive's custodian network uses for the highest priority operational status. The word was compromised. Here is what compromised meant. Not compromised in the partial sense that Marta's contact network had been compromised at 088209001 update. The entity using the BIS investigation as a mirror without the analyst's knowledge. Not compromised in the monitoring sense that the December 2005 archive access had produced the entity finding a location and choosing not to close it. Compromised in the specific operational sense that the custodian's identity, the node's location, and the cross-referencing material stored in the node had been accessed by the entity in a form that the entity could use operationally. The Geneva node had not just been identified, it had been read. Stop. This is the moment I need you to stay with me, because the Geneva node's compromise meant that the entity now knew what the archive contained in its most sensitive cross-referencing category. Not the individual entries; those were distributed across 5 cities, and the entity had access to, at most, one node's material from the December 2005 Washington access. The Geneva node held the cross-referencing index, the specific document that connected the individual entries in each city's node to each other, that provided the analytical framework through which the archive's collective evidentiary weight produced the 0.99 probability assessment. The index that Walsh had maintained since the Beirut formalization and had transferred to Geneva when she left the DIA in late 2004, the entity had the index, not the entries. The index. This is the operational distinction that makes the Geneva Compromise more significant than the Washington 2005 access. An entry documents a specific data point. The index documents the framework through which data points become an evidentiary structure. An entity that has the entries without the index has a collection of documented facts. An entity that has the index without the entries has the architecture of the documentation, the specific analytical framework that reveals what the archive is building toward and how the individual entries contribute to the collective evidentiary weight. The entity, as of October 2007, had both the entries from the Washington node, the index from the Geneva node. Not the complete archive 5 cities, and 2 were accessed, but enough to understand what the archive contained and how it worked. Enough to understand the threshold. Enough to understand that the documentation had reached 0.99. Enough to understand that the external review pathway had been initiated. Enough to understand what the archive's next entry would need to be to produce the judicial mechanism's response. The entity had read the archive's next move before the archive made it. I stood in front of the stating, Cathedral St. Pierre, for 7 seconds after retrieving the message. 7 seconds longer than the formation's standard immediate action threshold, but shorter than the analytical processing threshold. The cold of the Old City Stone at 0900 hours in October, 7 degrees Celsius, the alpine cold that Geneva carries from the surrounding mountains, different from the Polish continental cold of Warsaw or the North Sea maritime cold of Amsterdam. The breath vapor lasted 1.6 seconds. Filed. Then I walked into the cathedral. Not for cover, though the cathedral's interior provided the specific kind of institutional cover that a tourist in Geneva's most prominent historic building provides. For the acoustics, the Cathedral St. Pierre's interior has a specific acoustic property that the formation had identified during the posting's preparation. The high-vaulted ceiling produces a reverb pattern that makes the acoustic surveillance methodology that the entity had been deploying in cafe environments in Warsaw and Prague and Amsterdam significantly less effective. The specific physics of a medieval acoustic space versus a modern commercial acoustic space. Sound dispersed in 12 directions rather than 2 or 3. Acoustic surveillance becomes directionally unreliable above ambient noise level in a reverb environment above 15 meters. I sat in a pew in the cathedral's north transept and made the first call of the day. To the Karim channel, not the abbreviated format, the full channel. What I needed was not an alert. It was a contingency. The Geneva Compromise required a response that the archive's standard protocols had been designed to produce but had never been required to execute. The contingency was this. If any of the 5 city nodes was compromised in the specific way that Geneva had been compromised, material accessed rather than merely identified, the archive's protocol required the immediate execution of a redundancy procedure that the Beirut formalization had built into the network's design. The procedure was called the dispersal protocol. Each custodian who held an intact node would, within 72 hours of receiving the dispersal trigger, create a secondary copy of their node's material in a new location, establishing a 6th node whose location was known only to the dispersing custodian and to the protocol's trigger sender. The 6th node would not be connected to the primary network through the standard cross-referencing methodology. It would be a standalone archive, independently usable, without the index that Geneva had provided. The dispersal protocol was the archive's answer to the index's compromise. If the entity had the index, the archive needed to make the index irrelevant by producing documentation that stood independently rather than through the index's framework. The 6-node dispersal would create 5 independent archives, each capable of supporting an external review submission without requiring the index to establish the evidentiary framework. The Kareem call activated the dispersal protocol at 0923 hours Geneva time. The 5 intact node custodians, Beirut, Amman, Washington, the 5th unspecified city, and the Kareem Parallel Archive, received the dispersal trigger simultaneously. 72 hours. Each custodian creating a secondary, standalone copy. The protocol executing itself across 5 cities while I sat in a medieval cathedral in Geneva, and the Rhone outside moved at 2.1 meters per second, and the entity read the cross-referencing index it had just acquired from the Geneva node. The protocol execution was the specific operational response to the entity's operational advance. The entity had read the index. The archive was making the index obsolete. Not by destroying the index, the entity had a copy which could not be taken back. By creating an archive that did not need the index. 5 standalone nodes, each independently sufficient. The entity's acquisition of the index had been designed to give the entity a map of the archive structure. The dispersal protocol converted the archive from a structured network into 5 independent documents. The map became a map of something that no longer existed. But the Geneva Compromise was not only an archival problem. The wrong man on the bench at 0847 hours was also an operational problem in the specific tactical sense that the formation had been building the carrying structure to handle. Someone had known the bench. Someone had known the signal. Someone had known the custodian's schedule and position well enough to replace him at the correct location at the correct hour. This was not the entity's standard monitoring capability. The entity had been monitoring the archive since December 2005, but monitoring an archive and knowing a specific custodian's emergency signal protocol required a level of operational specificity that monitoring alone could not produce. The entity had a source inside the archives. Custodian network. Not Marta. Marta was not a custodian. The BIS investigation had been adjacent to the archive, not inside it. The source was a custodian. One of the 7 people whose knowledge of the emergency signal protocol was operational rather than theoretical. The probability assessment ran on this without the analytical luxury of 11 seconds. 7 custodians. 5 city nodes plus the dispersal trigger recipients. The Geneva custodian was the compromised node, either the source or the victim of the source. The source probability assessment, based on the specific operational knowledge required to produce the wrong man on the bench at the correct location and correct hour, placed the Geneva custodian's probability at 0.71, most likely to be the source, through coercion or inducement rather than willing collaboration. The specific category of custodian compromise that the entity's visibility management methodology preferred over direct elimination, 0.71, filed. The dispersal protocol's execution would need to account for a source whose identity was not confirmed. The dispersal trigger had gone to 5 cities. If the Geneva custodian was the source and was in contact with the entity now knew the dispersal protocol had been activated. The entity did not know the 6 new node locations. Those were determined by each custodian independently, without communicating the location through any channel the entity had access to. But the entity knew the dispersal was happening. The map was being replaced by 5 standalone documents. The entity's 72-hour window to use the index before it became operationally irrelevant had just started running. What the entity would do with 72 hours and a cross-referencing index and a space B. Known dispersal protocol was the specific question that the Geneva posting's remaining operational time needed to answer. The answer came at 1,347 hours the same day. Not from the Karim Channel. Not from the cathedral. From the specific operational environment that Geneva's private banking sector provided and that the posting's cover had been designed to access. From a contact inside a bank whose institutional position gave him access to the specific category of financial records that the Amsterdam posting had identified as the Western segment's clearing function. A contact who called the posting's cover number at 1,347 hours and said 4 words in French that I will translate, because the French is in the operational file and the translation is what belongs in this account. They are moving the money. Moving the money. The financial network's Amsterdam clearing function activated in an emergency transfer protocol. Not the standard operational transfer cycle that the Amsterdam posting had documented, the slow, regular, deliberately unremarkable movement of resources between Central European nodes and American institutional recipients that was designed to be invisible through its ordinariness. An emergency transfer. The specific activation pattern of a financial network that has assessed a threat to its operational security and is moving its resources out of reach before the threat materializes. The entity, with the Geneva Index and the knowledge that the dispersal protocol was executing, had assessed that the archive's evidentiary weight in its dispersal form would produce a judicial response that could reach the financial network through the external review pathway that the Amsterdam posting had established. The entity was moving the financial network's resources before the judicial response could freeze them. The 72-hour dispersal window was also the entity's 72-hour window to move the money. I left the cathedral at 1,352 hours, the old city's narrow streets down to the lake. The Quai du Mont-Blanc, the Rhône to my left at 2.1 meters per second. Lake Geneva to my right, the specific flat gray-blue of an alpine lake in October. The Mont Blanc Massif, visible above the opposite shore through the morning's clearing cloud. The specific cold clarity of a high-altitude water body that produces a color no river in the operational career had produced. Not glacial flower gray-blue, deeper. The accumulated blue of 200 meters of clear alpine water above its floor. The formation registered this as a supplementary entry alongside the Rhone's main calibration, 2 water bodies in the same city. Filed. The second call of the day went to the attorney, whose 19-minute conversation in Amsterdam had produced the response filing and the external review pathway. The call lasted 9 minutes. The financial network's emergency transfer activation, documented through the bank contact's specific institutional access, was exactly the category of asset movement that the judicial mechanism's sealed submission framework could reach through an emergency application, not the standard review process. An emergency asset freeze application, the specific judicial mechanism for situations in which documented assets connected to documented institutional misconduct are actively being moved to avoid the review process that has been formally initiated. The emergency application required 2 things. The bank contacts documented evidence of the emergency transfer activation provided through a specific financial records access protocol that the posting's cover had been designed to enable. And the archive's 0.99 probability assessment, combined with the dispersal protocol's standalone documentation as the evidentiary basis for the freeze application, both were available. The application was filed at 1,628 hours Geneva time, 3 hours and 24 minutes after the bank contact's call. The judicial mechanism's emergency process operated faster than the standard review process, the specific procedural advantage of an emergency application that meets the documented asset movement threshold. The freeze application was accepted at 2,147 hours Geneva time, subject to the 60-day review process that the emergency framework requires. The entity's financial network had not moved far enough. The 72-hour window had become less than 8 hours because the archive's dispersal protocol's execution had been faster than the entity had assessed. The 5 standalone nodes had been established. The Karim Channel confirmed completion from 4 of the 5 cities by 1800 hours, the 5th confirming at 2034 hours. The standalone archive had been operational before the emergency freeze application was filed. The external review pathway had the evidentiary basis it needed without the index. The freeze application had caught the financial network's emergency transfer in mid-movement, partially completed, partially frozen, the specific operational outcome of an entity that had activated its emergency protocol 72 hours too late. The Geneva posting continued through November of 2007. The financial crisis that had been building in the global banking system since the previous spring, the specific systemic failure of mortgage-backed securities that would by September of 2008 produce the largest banking collapse since 1929, was already visible in the Geneva banking environment in October 2007. The private banking sector that the postings cover had been using as its institutional environment was processing the first significant stress indicators of what would become the crisis's full expression. The specific operational consequence for the archive's financial network was significant. The systems through which the network had been moving operational resources through legitimate financial infrastructure were under the same stress as the broader financial system, and the emergency freeze application's 60-day review process was occurring simultaneously with the banking sector's first major liquidity events. The financial crisis provided the archive with an unexpected operational advantage. The judicial freeze application, combined with the banking sector's stress indicators, produced a specific evidentiary context in which the financial network's emergency transfer, already partially documented by the bank contacts records and partially frozen by the judicial mechanism, became visible to the broader financial regulatory environment as an anomalous capital movement in a period of systemic stress. Anomalous capital movements in periods of systemic stress attract regulatory attention that is independent of any judicial mechanism. The archive's documentation and the financial crisis's regulatory response were converging on the same financial network from different directions. The formation has a term for this: compound pressure, the specific operational condition in which multiple independent forces are acting on the same target simultaneously, each force operating through a different institutional channel, the compound effect exceeding what any single force could produce. The archive, at 0.99, was one force. The external review pathway was another. The emergency freeze application was a third. The financial crisis's regulatory attention was a fourth. Compound pressure filed. The Geneva posting's custodian situation resolved itself in the posting's third week, not through the formation's investigation. The formation does not investigate its own custodians. The archive's protocols specifically prohibit direct investigation as a threat to operational security through the dispersal protocol's execution. The 5th standalone node, the last to confirm completion, delayed by 12 hours from the others, confirmed through a channel that indicated the Geneva custodian had not been the source of the bench compromise. The Geneva custodian had been physically separated from the node by the entity's operation, not induced or coerced, but removed from access through an institutional mechanism that the entity had used through the custodian's employer. A personnel action. The specific institutional tool that the entity had deployed against Walsh inside the DIA and that had been adapted for deployment against the Geneva custodian inside the private banking sector. The personnel action had temporarily separated the custodian from the node's physical location. A replacement custodian, the wrong man on the bench, had been inserted by the entity to intercept the scheduled contact. The entity had not compromised the custodian. The entity had circumvented the custodian. The 0.71 probability assessment for the Geneva custodian as a source updated to 0.09. The source was not inside the archive's custodian network. The source was the same intelligence that had been feeding the entity's operational decisions since Prague. The partially penetrated BIS contact network, still operational despite the 0.91 flag, still providing the entity with enough operational intelligence to identify the Geneva node through the composite maps cross-referencing without having direct access to the custodian network. The entity did not have a source inside the archive. The entity had a source inside the investigation that had helped the archive build the composite map. The distinction mattered. Not because it changed the Geneva Compromise's operational consequences. The entity had the index, regardless of how it had obtained the Geneva node's location, but because it changed the archive's vulnerability assessment. The custodian network was intact. 5 custodians in 5 cities, plus the Karim parallel. No internal source. The entity was operating on the outside of the archive, not from within it. The dispersal protocol's standalone nodes were secure. The archive was intact. Lake Geneva, on the last morning of the posting, the 22nd of November 2007. The water at 1.2 meters per second through the outlet to the Rhône, the lake's own current, distinct from the Rhône's faster alpine pace, the specific movement of a contained water body releasing into a river. The Mont Blanc Massif, visible above the southern shore through the November clearing, the first significant snowfall of the alpine winter on the upper peaks, -2 degrees Celsius at the lake level. The breath vapor lasted 2.1 seconds longer than Prague's 1.9, shorter than Warsaw's 2.8, the specific cold of an alpine lake city in its first winter month. Filed. The posting concluded at 1,340 hours. The judicial freeze application in its review process. The dispersal protocol's 6 standalone nodes, operational across 5 cities, and the Karim parallel. The financial crisis's regulatory attention converging on the partially frozen network, the external review pathway continuing, the archive at 0.99 and intact. The Geneva node's material compromised, but the index made operationally irrelevant by 5 independent archives that did not need it. The entity had read the map. The archive had become unmappable. The Rhône continued at 2.1 meters per second through the city toward France. Lake Geneva continued at 1.2 meters per second through its outlet. 2 water bodies in the same city, the same water, in 2 different registers contained and moving. The archive in the same condition. Contained in 5 cities and 6 standalone nodes. Moving toward the thresholds evaluation through the external review pathway that was now supported by compound pressure from 4 independent directions. The entity had made 2 significant operational moves in October 2007, the Geneva Index access and the financial network emergency transfer. Both had been countered. The archive was intact. The network was partially frozen. The pressure was compound and building. The bank holds. The water moves. Mevcut metni okuyorum. Tam olarak nerede bittiğini görüyorum. Devam ediyorum. Aynı ses. Tekrar yok. Tempo düşmüyor. There is one operational element of the Geneva posting that the summary has not yet contained, and it belongs here because it is the specific kind of cost that this account documents alongside findings. The cost is not the Geneva node's compromise. The dispersal protocol addressed the compromise operationally within 24 hours. The cost is what happened in the 43 seconds on the Quai du Mont-Blanc before I walked to the Cathedral Saint-Pierre. In those 43 seconds, standing above the Rhône at 2.1 meters per second, I ran a probability assessment on the Geneva custodian that reached 0.71. I filed it. I activated the dispersal protocol with the 0.71 assessment informing its execution. The 0.71 was wrong. It updated to 0.09 inches the posting's 3rd week, when the dispersal protocol's execution confirmed that the custodian had been circumvented rather than compromised. But the dispersal protocol's execution had been shaped by the 0.71 assessment specifically. The standalone nodes had been established with an additional security layer that the protocol did not require in its standard form. A layer that added 12 hours to the fifth node's establishment timeline, and that the assessment's uncertainty about the custodian's integrity had made operationally necessary. 12 hours. The fifth standalone node, confirming at 2034 rather than 1800. The emergency freeze application filed at 1628. The 5-node standalone confirmation complete before the application was accepted. But the margin had been 12 hours narrower than it needed to be, because the 0.71 assessment had added a security layer the protocol did not require. The formation's probability assessment had been wrong in a way that had not changed the outcome but had compressed the operational margin. The margin had held. The margin was not always going to hold. The 0.71 needed to be in the record as a wrong assessment, not as a correct one that happened to produce the right outcome. The formation makes wrong assessments. The archive documents them alongside the correct ones. Documented uncertainty is better than undocumented confidence. The 0.71 is in the Geneva entries, alongside the 0.09 that corrected it, filed. Now I want to give you something about the Rhône that the 43-second Quai du Mont-Blanc registration captured, but that the calibration entry alone does not convey. The Rhône at Geneva carries a specific quality that no other river in the operational career's geography has produced. It is the fastest of the career's 19 primary water bodies, 2.1 meters per second, faster than the Rhine at 2 meters per second, faster than the Vltava at 1.3 inches its autumn volume, faster than anything else in the operational map. But the speed is not the quality. The quality is what the speed contains. The Rhône at Geneva is carrying the Alps, not the Alps sediment. The Vistula carries sediment. The Rhône carries the Alps energy. The kinetic force of water that has descended from 4,000 meters of elevation is still present in the river at lake level, channeled and directed, but not spent. The river that exits Lake Geneva has already given its fine rock flour to the lake. The glacial sediment settles in the lake's deep water, and the Rhône that exits Geneva is clearer than the Rhône that enters it from the Valais. What has not settled is the force, the speed. The river leaving Geneva is the same speed as the river entering, because the speed is not sediment, it is energy. The Alps' gravitational energy, converted across the descent, still present in the water at 2.1 meters per second through the city at lake level. The formation registered this as the operational career's most energy-dense water body. Not the most powerful, the Bosphorus carries more total volume. Not the deepest Lake Geneva is deeper than any river in the career's geography. The most energy-dense, the specific combination of speed and clarity and contained force that produces the quality of a river that has given up its solids but not its momentum, filed. The Rhône as calibration reference. The archive's energy at 0.99 has the same quality clarity achieved. The analytical sediment settled into the evidentiary record over 14 years. The momentum, not spent but present. The force that was built across Pittsburgh and Vienna and Berlin and Budapest and Brussels and Amman and Washington and Istanbul and Beirut and Cairo and Warsaw and Prague and Amsterdam, still moving through the Geneva posting at the same speed it had achieved when the documentation reached the threshold. The clarity is the settled sediment of the evidentiary record. The force is what moves after. The posting's second significant operational event occurred on the 14th of November 2007, day 47 of the Geneva posting, day 23 after the dispersal protocol's completion. Not in Geneva, through the Karim channel. A communication from the Beirut node's custodian, the same channel that had carried the March 2003 Corniche disclosure, the December 2005 archive access alert, the March 2007 7-sentence communication about the Walsh timeline. This communication was different in register from all of those. Not an alert, not a timeline update. An observation. The Beirut custodian's observation. Transmitted through the channel in the specific format used for operational intelligence that is not yet at the assessment threshold, but that the formation needs to have in the record before the assessment is possible. The observation was this: the entity's subject, the trajectory assessment, at 0.94, the name on the August 1994 list. The man who had walked through the Cairo Cafe door at 0938 on the 17th of February, 2004, and then through the Warsaw Cafe line of sight at 1814 on December 3, 2005, had made a direct contact, not a behavioral acknowledgement like the 0.8 seconds of eye contact, not a presence communication like the Warsaw Cafe, a direct contact. A communication to a third party whose identity the Beirut custodian's observation had captured, transmitted through the Karim channel for the formation's assessment. The communication to the third party contained two elements: an acknowledgement that the documentation process existed and had reached the threshold, and an offer. The offer was specific, not a threat. The entity's subject had assessed threats as below the threshold for changing the documentation process's operational status, and the trajectory assessment's 16-year record confirmed that the subject understood the documentation's protective logic. Not a negotiation, the subject had read the index and understood what the archive contained. An offer of a specific category of information that the archive did not contain and could not produce through its current methodology. Information about the institutional dynamic that had been operating in the space between the entity's subject's official authority and the entity's operational activities, the specific gap that the documentation had been mapping since Brussels in 1995, but that the documentation's angle of observation had never been able to fully capture from the inside. The subject was offering to become a source. The formation processed this for longer than 11 seconds. Not because the probability assessment required more time, the assessment ran at operational speed and produced a finding within the standard window. Because the weight of the finding required the specific additional processing that the formation reserves for assessments that have no clear operational precedent in the career's prior experience, 31 seconds. Then the assessment. 0.61. Probability that the offer was genuine, not the 0.96 of the Budapest Hungarian document, not the 0.97 of the Prague direct financial link. 0.61. The specific weight of an offer that is more likely genuine than not, but whose genuineness cannot be confirmed without an operational engagement that itself carries operational risk. The entity's subject offering to become a source was either a genuine operational defection by an actor who had assessed that the documentation's threshold crossing made the alternative untenable, or it was a sophisticated attempt to introduce controlled information into the archive through the same methodology the subject had used to monitor the BIS investigation, providing genuine material alongside shaped material in a way that served the entity's interest in managing the archive's scope. 0.61 for genuine, 0.39 for controlled information. The formation does not act on 0.61 without additional verification that would move the assessment toward one of the thresholds, the 0.67 action threshold or the 0.33 rejection threshold. The Beirut communication entered the archive as an open finding, not resolved, not rejected, filed at 0.61, pending verification. The specific status of a development that the formation had been building toward since 1988, and that had arrived in a form that required more caution than the weight of the moment suggested. The Karim response to the Beirut observation contained 3 words: do not respond. The 3 words were the correct operational response to a 0.61 probability finding in a posting that was 11 days from conclusion. Not because responding was wrong in principle, a genuine source offer from the entity's subject would be the archive's most significant single development since the Prague direct financial link, because responding in the posting's final 11 days With a dispersal protocol recently completed, and the freeze application in its 60-day review, and the compound pressure from 4 independent directions, building toward the entity's institutional response, would introduce an uncontrolled variable into an operational situation that had, for the first time in the archive's 24-year history, reached a state of controlled compound pressure. The formation's compound pressure was working. The entity was under 4 simultaneous forces. Adding a 0.61 probability source engagement to an already loaded operational situation was the specific kind of operational overreach that the formation had been trained to avoid since the Vienna posting in 1986, when the first probability assessment had been wrong in a way that had cost 3 months of operational progress. Do not respond. The Beirut observation entered the archive at 0.61. Filed. The source offer from the entity's subject remained open. The archive would address it in the next operational environment, the specific posting that the external review pathway's 60-day review process, and the freeze application's resolution, and the dispersal protocol's 6 standalone nodes would define as the necessary next step. Lake Geneva on the last morning, the Rhone at 2.1 meters per second, the Mont Blanc Massif above the southern shore with its first alpine winter snow on the upper peaks. The formation registering the compound pressure's 4 forces as a single calibration reference alongside the 2 water bodies. Filed. The archive has never been more complete. The archive has never been more intact. The archive has never been more clearly positioned for the external evaluation that the documentation's threshold crossing in Amsterdam has made possible. And the archive has, in the Beirut observation's 0.61 filing, its most significant open question since the Baghdad question in 1999 that produced the Brussels probability update and the Washington desk posting. The entity's subject has made an offer. The formation has not responded. The offer is in the archive. The 60-day review is running. The compound pressure is building. The dispersal protocol's 6 standalone nodes are operational. The Rhone carries the Alps energy at 2.1 meters per second through the city at lake level. The force that has descended from 4,000 meters of elevation is not spent at the lake. It is channeled, moving, present. The archive grows. The Gray Operative, every week, without exception. Start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. The architecture holds. The significance is approaching. Stay in the shadows.